My son stood near the grill at our family cookout, looking out at my vegetable garden, and told his cousins it was a waste of good land. Honestly, land that could have held a pool or a nice patio, something the family could actually enjoy together. A few people laughed. Nobody disagreed with him. I was standing nearby, holding a bowl of tomatoes I had just picked that morning, and I heard every word. I did not say anything. I simply carried the bowl to the kitchen table and kept working, the way I always did. What my son did not know, what almost nobody in my family knew, was that for the past 6 years, I had been selling the harvest from that garden every single season and using the money to pay off his own father's hospital bills. Bills that would have crushed our family financially if I had not found a quiet way to handle them myself. My name is Marguerite Duchamp. I am 66 years old. I have grown vegetables in that same patch of land for over 30 years. And this is the story of the summer my family finally understood exactly what that garden had been doing. All those years they thought it was simply an old woman's hobby. I want to start at the beginning because I think it will help explain everything that came after. I grew up on a small farm, the daughter of 2 hardworking people who grew almost everything we ate. My father, Leopold, and my mother, Cordelia, taught me how to work the soil before I was old enough to remember learning it. By the time I was 6 years old, I knew how to plant beans in straight rows, how to tell when a tomato was ready to pick, how to save seeds at the end of the season so we would have something to plant again the following spring. I married my husband, Halvard Duchamp, when I was 23 years old. Halvard worked as a mechanic his whole life, fixing cars and trucks at a small shop in our town, honest work that paid steady but never made us rich. We bought a modest house on the edge of town with a decent piece of land behind it, and one of the very first things I did, before we had even finished unpacking all our boxes, was start turning part of that land into a garden. Over the years, that garden grew larger and more productive. I grew tomatoes, squash, beans, corn, peppers, all sorts of things more than our own family could ever eat on its own. In the early years, I gave most of the extra away to neighbors, to the church, to anyone who could use it. It felt good to grow something useful with my own hands and share it freely. Halvard and I had 2 children, a son named Thibaut and a daughter named Perpetua. Thibaut was 3 years older, and from a young age, he was the more restless of the 2, always eager to be somewhere bigger and busier than our quiet little town. Perpetua was quieter, more like me in some ways, though she moved away too, eventually, for a good job in a nearby city. Halvard passed away 9 years ago, from a stroke that came on suddenly, without much warning. I was 57 years old when I became a widow. It was a hard year, but I had my garden to lean on, the same steady, patient work that had comforted me through difficult times before. I remember, in the months right after Halvard died, spending long hours in that garden simply because I did not know what else to do with myself. The house felt too quiet without him, too full of the small habits we had built together over 34 years of marriage, the sound of the television he liked to watch in the evenings, the particular way he cleared his throat before saying something important. The garden, though, stayed exactly as steady and demanding as it had always been. It did not care that I was grieving. It simply needed watering and weeding and attention, the same as always, and in a strange way, that steadiness became a kind of comfort. I could not control the fact that Halvard was gone, but I could control whether the beans got picked on time, whether the tomatoes got staked properly before a summer storm. That small, patient control, I think, is what got me through that first difficult year more than almost anything else. About a year after Halvard passed, my son Thibaut's own health took a frightening turn. He was 40 years old at the time, married to a woman named Delphine, with 2 young children of his own. He began having chest pains that turned out to be a serious heart problem, one that required an emergency surgery, followed by a long, difficult recovery. Followed by several more surgeries over the following 2 years as doctors worked to fully correct the problem. I want to explain how serious this became because it matters for the rest of the story. Thibaut's job, at the time, was as a delivery driver for a regional company, work that did not come with especially strong health insurance. Delphine worked part-time at a daycare, also with limited insurance of her own. Between the two of them, the coverage they had simply could not keep up with the true cost of Thibaut's care. The hospital bills, over those 2 years, grew into an amount that felt, honestly, almost impossible to imagine paying off. I remember Thibaut calling me one evening, his voice shaking, telling me the total number, a number so large it made my chest feel tight just hearing it. I did not have that kind of money sitting in a bank account somewhere. Halvard and I had lived carefully our whole lives, but we had never been wealthy people. What I had, instead, was land and years of experience knowing how to make that land produce something valuable. I made a decision that year, quietly, without telling Thibaut or Delphine or anyone else in the family exactly what I intended to do. I decided to expand my garden significantly, turning what had always been a modest backyard plot into something much larger and more serious, and I decided I would sell the harvest, rather than simply giving it away the way I always had before, and use every single dollar of that money toward Thibaut's hospital bills. I want to explain how this actually worked, because I think the details matter. I contacted a woman named Bernadette Ashworth, who ran a small farmer's market stand about 20 minutes from my house, and asked whether she would be willing to sell my vegetables alongside her own, in exchange for a modest commission. She agreed readily, having tasted my tomatoes at a church potluck years earlier and remembered them fondly. I also reached out to 2 small local restaurants, whose owners I had known for years, and asked whether they would be interested in buying fresh vegetables directly from me each week during the growing season. Both said yes, happy to have a reliable, high-quality local source. Bernadette became, over those 6 years, something close to a true friend, someone who understood, without me ever fully explaining it, that these vegetables mattered to me in a way that went beyond simple extra income. She would set aside the best spot at her stand for my baskets each week, and she never once questioned why an older widow was suddenly growing 3 times as much as she used to, or why I always seemed so quietly relieved whenever a good sales week came together. I think, looking back, she may have suspected something was going on beyond ordinary hobby gardening, though she was kind enough never to pry. I expanded the garden considerably that first spring, clearing more of our backyard, building new raised beds, working from early morning until it grew too dark to see, most days, all through that first difficult season. I want to be honest that it was hard, physical work, harder than I had done in many years, and there were evenings I came inside so tired I could barely lift my arms to make dinner. But there was also, underneath that tiredness, a real sense of purpose that carried me through it. By the end of that first expanded season, I had earned a little over $4,000 from the harvest, money I sent directly to Thibaut, telling him only that I had some savings I wanted to help with, without explaining the actual source. He was deeply grateful and a little emotional on the phone, telling me he had not expected help like that from me, given how carefully Halvard and I had always lived. I did not correct his assumption that this was simply old savings. I want to explain why, because I think it matters for understanding the years that followed. I did not want Thibaut, already carrying so much worry about his health and his family's finances, to also carry guilt about his mother working herself hard in a garden every single day to help pay his bills. I wanted him to simply receive the help and focus on getting well, without an extra layer of worry weighing him down. So the pattern continued, quietly, for 6 full years. Every spring, I expanded the garden a little more, working with Bernadette at the farmer's market, working with the 2 restaurants, and later a 3rd one that heard about my vegetables through word of mouth. Every fall, once the harvest money came in, I sent whatever I could to Thibaut and Delphine, sometimes for hospital bills directly, sometimes to help with the mounting cost of Thibaut's medications, sometimes simply to ease the pressure on their household budget during a stretch when Thibaut could not work full hours because of his ongoing recovery. Over those 6 years, I sold, by my own careful records, a little over $31,000 worth of vegetables, nearly all of it going directly toward my son's medical costs. I kept detailed records of every single sale, in a simple notebook I stored in my kitchen drawer, partly out of old habit from years of careful household budgeting, and partly, I think, because some quiet part of me understood that someday this record might matter. I remember one particular season, the third summer of Thibaut's recovery, when a hailstorm swept through our area in early July and destroyed nearly a third of my crop overnight. I remember standing in the garden the next morning, looking at the damaged squash plants and the torn tomato leaves, feeling something close to despair. Knowing that Thibaut had a difficult surgery scheduled for later that month and that the money from that particular harvest had been counted on to help cover it. I did not have the luxury, that summer, of simply accepting the loss and waiting for the following year. I spent the rest of that week replanting what could still be replanted, working from before sunrise until well after dark, determined to salvage as much of the season as I possibly could. It was not a full recovery, but by careful, exhausting effort, I managed to bring in enough by the end of August to cover most of what was needed. I never told Thibaut about that hailstorm or how close that particular season came to falling short. I simply made sure the money arrived when it needed to, the way it always had. I never once told the wider family what I was doing. Perpetua, my daughter, knew a little more than most because she lived close enough to visit often and had seen, over the years, just how much time and effort I poured into that garden. But even she did not know the full financial picture, only that I seemed to genuinely enjoy the work and that I occasionally sold vegetables at the market for a little extra spending money. To the rest of the family, especially the younger generation, my nephews and nieces, and eventually my own grandchildren, the garden simply became Grandma's hobby, something a little old-fashioned, mildly interesting, but not especially important. Certainly nothing anyone thought to ask deeper questions about. I did not mind this for most of those 6 years. I was not doing the work for recognition. I was doing it because it was the one meaningful thing I could offer my son during the hardest stretch of his life, and because, honestly, the work itself gave me a sense of purpose during years that might otherwise have felt very lonely. Living alone in that house after Halvard passed. The comment that finally made me stop and really feel the weight of being overlooked happened this past summer at our family's annual cookout, an event I had hosted at my own house for over 20 years. The same backyard where my garden had quietly grown and grown, season after season. The whole extended family had gathered that day, nearly 30 people, spread across the yard with plates of food, children running between the tables, the usual happy noise of a summer gathering. Thibaut, now fully recovered and doing well, healthier than he had been in years, was standing near the grill with his own teenage son and several nephews, talking about ideas for improving the backyard. I was inside for a few minutes, bringing out a fresh bowl of tomatoes I had just picked that morning, when I heard Thibaut's voice carry across the yard, easy and confident, the way people speak when they are simply making conversation, not thinking carefully about who might overhear. Honestly, he was saying, gesturing toward my garden, that whole section back there is kind of a waste of good land. Mom's had it going for years, and I get that she enjoys it, but think about what we could actually do with that space. A pool. A nice patio for gatherings like this. Something the whole family could actually use together, instead of just rows of vegetables nobody really needs anymore. A few of the younger cousins laughed, nodding in agreement. Nobody spoke up to disagree. I stood near the kitchen door for a moment, bowl of tomatoes in my hands, feeling something old and tired settle over me. 6 years. $31,000. Countless early mornings and exhausted evenings, all quietly poured into that patch of ground, into keeping my own son's family from drowning under medical debt during the hardest years of his life. And here he stood, healthy and recovered, calling that same ground a waste, in front of the whole family, without a single memory, it seemed, of where the help that carried him through those years had actually come from. I did not say anything in that moment. I carried the tomatoes to the table, set the bowl down carefully, and went back inside for a moment, standing quietly at my kitchen sink, taking a few slow breaths before I returned to the party. I want to explain what I decided to do next, because I think the way I handled it matters more than the sting of the comment itself. I did not confront Thibaut that day, in front of the whole family, the way some part of me might have wanted to in the raw heat of that moment. I have never been someone who handles hurt well in front of an audience. I finished out the rest of the cookout quietly, smiling, serving food, watching my grandchildren play, the way I always did, letting the sting sit privately in my chest rather than spilling it out in front of 30 relatives. But that evening, once everyone had gone home and the yard was quiet again, I sat down at my kitchen table with the same notebook I had kept for 6 years, the one recording every single sale from that garden. I looked through it carefully, page after page, remembering each season as I read through the entries. The spring Thibaut had his first surgery when I sold nearly $600 of early lettuce and peas in a single month. The difficult summer 2 years later, during his third surgery, when I worked through a heat wave so severe I nearly fainted twice in the garden, determined to get that season's tomatoes to market on time because I knew the money was needed urgently that particular month. I decided, sitting there that evening, that it was finally time for my family to understand the truth. Not out of anger, exactly, though I will admit some anger was mixed in there too. But mostly out of a simple, tired wish to finally be seen clearly, after 6 years of quiet, invisible effort. I called Perpetua first, the next morning, and told her everything, the full financial picture she had only partly understood before. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said, softly, "Mom, I had no idea it was that much. I knew you sold vegetables, but I never understood it was actually paying for Thibaut's medical bills all this time." I told her I thought it was finally time for the rest of the family to understand too, and I asked for her help arranging a proper family conversation, rather than simply blurting the truth out in anger at the next gathering. Perpetua agreed, and together we planned a quiet dinner, just the 4 of us, me, Perpetua, Thibaut, and Delphine, at my house about 2 weeks after the cookout, once I had time to gather myself and think clearly about how I wanted to explain everything. I want to describe that dinner carefully, because I think it shows something important about how these difficult family conversations can actually unfold when approached with patience rather than pure anger. We sat together at my kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten countless quiet dinners alone since Halvard passed, and I brought out my notebook, setting it carefully in front of Thibaut. "I heard what you said at the cookout," I told him, keeping my voice steady and calm. "About the garden being a waste of good land. I want to show you something before we talk about it." I opened the notebook and walked him through it, page by page, season by season. I explained how I had expanded the garden 6 years earlier, right when his health crisis began. I explained the arrangement with Bernadette at the farmer's market, the relationships with the local restaurants, the careful records I had kept of every single sale. I explained, finally, exactly where that $31,000 had gone, year after year, straight into the hospital bills and medications that had carried him through his recovery. Thibaut went very pale as I spoke, staring down at the notebook, flipping slowly through the pages himself once I finished explaining. Delphine, sitting beside him, had tears in her eyes, her hand pressed against her mouth. "Mom," Thibaut finally said, his voice cracking, "I thought that money was just old savings. Something you and Dad had set aside years ago. I never once thought to ask where it was actually coming from. I just took it, grateful, and never looked closely enough to understand what it was actually costing you. I didn't want you to know at the time," I told him honestly. "You were sick and scared and trying to hold your family together. I didn't want to add guilt on top of everything else you were already carrying. I wanted you to simply focus on getting well. But I think, looking back, I let that kindness go on a little too long, without ever letting you understand the truth. And then, standing at my own cookout, hearing you call that same garden a waste of good land, I realized how much you truly did not understand about what those rows of vegetables had actually been doing all these years." Thibaut put his face in his hands for a moment, and when he looked back up, his eyes were wet. "I am so ashamed," he said. "Not just of the comment at the cookout, though that alone is bad enough. I'm ashamed that I never once, in 6 years, thought to ask more carefully where that help was coming from. I just assumed, because you're my mother, that helping me was simply easy for you, something that cost you nothing. I never considered that it might have cost you 6 years of exhausting work out in that garden, day after day, just to keep our family from drowning. I told him I appreciated him saying that honestly, and that I had not shared the truth in order to make him feel guilty now, but simply because I thought he deserved to finally understand the real shape of his own life, and the real shape of what his mother had actually been doing all those quiet years. Delphine spoke up then, wiping her eyes. "I want you to know," she said, "that I think about those years constantly, how frightened I was, how impossible the bills seemed. I remember, more than once, lying awake at night, terrified we would lose everything. And then help would arrive, quietly, exactly when we needed it most. I never once questioned where it came from either. I think, in the middle of a crisis like that, you simply grab onto whatever lifeline appears, without stopping to ask hard questions about where it's actually coming from. I am so sorry we never asked." "I don't want either of you to carry guilt about this," I told them, reaching across the table to take Thibaut's hand in mine. "That was never my purpose in showing you the notebook tonight. I did it because I wanted to finally be understood, not because I wanted you to spend the rest of your lives feeling sorry. Guilt does not undo anything, and it certainly does not need to sit between us now, when the hardest years are already behind us." Thibaut nodded slowly, though I could see the guilt sitting there anyway, the way guilt often does regardless of how kindly you try to wave it away. "Can I ask you something?" he said, after a long quiet moment. "Why vegetables? You could have asked any of us for help directly. Perpetua would have given anything she had. I would have found some way, even if it meant taking on debt myself. Why carry this alone, in a garden, rather than simply telling us the truth from the start and letting the whole family share the weight of it together?" I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted him to understand something true about who I am, not just about what I had done. "Because I am your mother," I told him. "And there is a particular kind of comfort, for a mother, in being the one who solves the hard problem quietly, rather than the one who hands the hard problem to her children to solve. I did not want you carrying worry about how the bills would be paid, on top of everything else you were already carrying. I wanted to give you one less thing to fear. And, honestly, working in that garden gave me a purpose during years that might otherwise have felt very lonely, living alone in this house after your father passed. It was never really a sacrifice in the way you might imagine it. It was also, in its own strange way, a gift I gave myself." Thibaut's eyes filled with tears again at that, and he squeezed my hand tightly. I want to explain what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because I think it shows something meaningful about how families can genuinely repair old, mistaken understandings, once someone finally takes the effort to look closely and honestly at the truth. Thibaut came to my house the following weekend, without being asked, and spent the whole day working alongside me in the garden, weeding, watering, learning, for the first time in his adult life, exactly how much careful, physical effort that ground actually required. He asked me question after question, genuinely curious now, about how I decided what to plant each season, how I managed the relationships with the restaurants and the farmers market, how I kept the whole operation running smoothly enough to produce that much money, year after year, largely by myself. I had no idea how much actual skill this took, he told me that evening, wiping dirt from his hands, looking out at the rows of vegetables with what looked, for the first time, like genuine respect rather than casual dismissal. I always just saw it as Mom's little garden. I never once thought about it as real, serious work, let alone work that had quietly held our whole family together during the hardest years of my life. At the next family gathering, a smaller dinner about a month later, Thibaut stood up before dessert was served and asked if he could say something to the whole family. He talked about his recovery, about how grateful he had always been for the help that got his family through those difficult years, and then, turning to me, he said, clearly and without any of his old careless tone, "I made a careless comment at the cookout this summer, calling my mother's garden a waste of good land. I want everyone here to know the truth. That garden paid for a significant part of my medical care during my recovery. My mother worked in that garden, tirelessly, for 6 years, to help save our family from a debt that could have broken us. I am deeply ashamed it took me this long to understand that, and deeply grateful now that I finally do." I remember feeling something warm settle in my chest at that moment, something that felt, finally, like being truly seen by the people I loved most. I want to explain what my garden looks like today, because I think it matters for how this story ends. The garden is still there, behind my house, the same patch of land Thibaut once suggested turning into a pool. But it looks a little different now than it did before that cookout. Thibaut comes most weekends now, helping me plant in the spring, helping me harvest in the late summer, bringing his own children along sometimes, teaching them, the way I once taught him and Perpetua, how to tell when a tomato is truly ready to pick. His son, my grandson Elston, who is 13 now, has taken a particular interest in the garden this past year, asking me detailed questions about soil and seasons and which vegetables grow well together in the same bed. I remember one afternoon this past spring, kneeling beside him in the dirt, showing him how to properly transplant a young pepper seedling without damaging its roots, and feeling a quiet, deep happiness watching him work so carefully, so seriously, at something that mattered to him. He asked me, that same afternoon, whether it was true that the garden had once paid for his father's hospital bills, and I told him yes, it was true. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's the coolest thing I've ever heard, Grandma. You saved Dad with vegetables." I laughed at that, though I also felt something tighten in my throat, a mixture of pride and tired relief that the truth had finally reached even the youngest members of our family. I still sell the harvest, though the money now goes toward different things, since Thibaut's medical bills have long since been paid in full. Some of it goes into a small college fund I have started for my grandchildren. Some of it I simply keep for myself, a modest cushion for my own retirement years, something I honestly had not built much of for myself during those 6 years of pouring everything into my son's recovery instead. I also, this past year, finally allowed myself something I had not done in a long time. I hired a young man from town, the grandson of an old friend, to help me one day a week with the heavier physical work, the digging and the lifting that had grown harder on my body as I moved further into my 60s. For 6 years, I had insisted on doing every bit of that work entirely alone, partly out of necessity and partly, I think, out of a stubborn pride that had grown up alongside the secret itself. Once the secret was finally out, once my family understood and appreciated what that garden had actually been doing, I found it easier to also accept a little help for myself, without feeling like I was somehow failing at the quiet, private mission I had carried for so long. I think often about that comment at the cookout, the one calling my garden a waste of good land. I do not believe Thibaut meant real cruelty by it. I think he simply believed, honestly and without much examination, a story about that garden that had been sitting there, unquestioned, for years, because I had never once insisted on correcting it. I have learned something important from all of this, something I try to remember even now. Quiet sacrifice does not announce itself. It simply happens, season after season, in small, patient, unglamorous ways, easy for the people around you to overlook entirely, especially if you never once ask them to notice. But quiet does not mean unimportant. Sometimes the most essential things happening in a family are the ones nobody thinks to ask about, growing steadily in rows nobody thought to look closely at, right in their own backyard. I think, too, about all the other quiet gardens out there, in other families, in other backyards, doing their own kind of invisible work that nobody has thought to ask about yet. A widow's careful budgeting that quietly keeps a household afloat. A grandmother's small sewing repairs that save a family real money, year after year, without anyone tallying it up. An aunt's patient hours of babysitting that let a young family keep working through a difficult stretch. I think about how easily the world overlooks this kind of steady, patient effort, simply because it does not announce itself loudly, and I hope, whenever I notice it now in someone else's life, that I remember to ask the deeper question, rather than simply accepting the easy, careless story on the surface. Delphine told me, at Christmas this past year, that she had started asking her own mother more careful questions about her life, after everything that happened with my garden. I realized, she told me, that I had probably been doing the same thing to my own mother that Thibaut did to you, assuming I understood her whole life without ever really asking. I don't want to make that mistake again with anyone I love. I told her I thought that was one of the wisest things to come out of this whole difficult summer, and I meant it completely. If someone in your own family looked at your quiet, patient work and decided, without ever really asking, that it was simply a waste of time or space, what would you do? Would you let the comments slide, the way I nearly did for 6 long years? Or would you finally do what I did and open that notebook, letting the truth of your own quiet sacrifice finally speak for itself?